Thanks for joining our live special coverage of the G7 Hiroshima Summit 2023. I'm Kim Dami in Seoul. It's day 2 of the Group of 7 summit in the western Japanese city of Hiroshima. President Yoon is there to speak at expanded G7 session on Saturday. Our top office correspondent Oh Soo-young is at the International Media Center to fill us in. Good afternoon, Soo-young.
Hi there, Tammy.
So Soo-young, President Yoon will participate in his first G7 session summit today. So what is he expected to highlight today?
Well, Tammy, President Yoon is expected to attend his first expanded session of the G7 summit here in Hiroshima. He's expected to really reaffirm South Korea's growing interest and role in global affairs as he takes part in the expanded session. Now, that's due to happen in a couple of hours, and it will be the first of the so-called outreach session, which is going to invite 8 guest countries, including South Korea, Australia, India, among others, to discuss food security, health, and gender issues and development as well. And President Yoon is expected to voice South Korea's position on these matters. And, well, according to his office, he's really going to highlight official development assistance. This, of course, makes sense as his administration's Indo-Pacific strategy looks to expand partnerships with emerging economies to bolster stability and prosperity based on liberal democratic values that he always emphasizes. A second session is going to open later in the afternoon, focusing on climate, energy and the environment. While the G7 summit itself opened yesterday, Saturday is the first day that the invited nations take part in the discussions. So President Yoon will be among the leaders that Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida greets, also in a welcoming event early in the afternoon. Then there's going to be a banquet in the evening.
Right, and before taking part in the G7 sessions, President Yoon has been keeping himself very busy with separate bilateral summits on the side as well, right, Soo-young?
That's right. He's on something of a diplomatic marathon here in Hiroshima, and he has a couple of bilaterals lined up today on Saturday, as he did yesterday. And his meetings include those with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as well as the PM of the United Kingdom, Rishi Sunak. And he just had a bilateral with the leader of India this morning. We have yet to hear details about that, but of course I'll be updating you throughout the day. And, well, he's again on quite a diplomatic streak here, and these meetings that he's having, they're very significant because they are again part of his Indo-Pacific outreach to countries as he looks to bolster security cooperation against North Korea's threats, but also to enhance economic security as well, due to the sort of trade and supply chain disturbances that we're seeing due to geopolitical conflicts. Now, that's something that he really emphasized on Friday when he met with the Prime Ministers of Australia and Vietnam in separate bilateral meetings. Yoon and Australian leader Anthony Albanese, they agreed to ramp up value-based communication as well as cooperation on critical mineral supply chains, very important for future technologies, as well as national security and defence technology. In his meeting with Pan Min-chin, the two leaders agreed to bolster trade and economic cooperation and pursue ODA projects together. The Vietnamese leader expressed appreciation for Seoul's ODA and said that he hopes to expand such projects, especially those in finance, technology and human development, along with exchanges in digital technology and science.
Sure, and of course, the biggest question is if a trilateral summit between South Korea, the U.S. and Japan is actually going to happen, right? Tell us more about that.
Indeed, so that really is the big question here. And obviously the leaders of South Korea, Japan and the US, they've been very eager to have this trilateral meeting, really to build on the summit that they had last November in Cambodia, where they agreed to ramp up security and economic cooperation. And of course, they're facing a lot of growing threat from North Korea, along with regional instability as well, due to the geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China. All of those things, they would probably discuss if they were to meet. And well, obviously since last November, since they last met, Seoul and Tokyo have seen a tremendous improvement in relations, working to restore security and economic cooperation after President Yoon presented a plan to compensate Korean wartime forced labor victims of Japanese companies through voluntary funding. And while going forward, the three countries are really going to want to check in on the progress of their three-way cooperation and discuss how to take things further, also possibly discuss the regional challenges mentioned before arising from geopolitical instability and China's growing economic coercion, of course, and naval presence in the South China Sea, which is being discussed by the G7 countries here in Hiroshima. And it's quite uncertain yet whether the meeting would produce a joint statement by South Korea, Japan and the US if the meeting happens. But most pundits say that it's quite unlikely that there will be such a landmark outcome. The meeting is very likely to be highly symbolic and significant, but as for tangibles or any kind of concrete details coming out of the meeting, we're going to have to see. We know that all the leaders' diaries are fully packed, especially with President Joe Biden, who would most likely have a one-on-one with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who's expected to arrive in Hiroshima Saturday evening. That's all from me for now, so let's wait and see what happens.
All right, but you'll be there in Hiroshima to keep us updated. Thanks, Soo-young. Now, also on the first day of the summit, the G7 leaders issued a joint statement on nuclear arms control, the very first such kind from the group. Our Choi Min-jung has details on the Hiroshima Vision of nuclear disarmament.
With rising concerns about escalating nuclear threats in the global community, the leaders of the G7 on Friday called for a world without nuclear weapons. In a joint statement dubbed the Hiroshima Vision on Nuclear Disarmament, the G7 nation urged North Korea, Russia, China, and Iran to cease provoking tensions with the use of nuclear weapons. They underscored that a world without nuclear weapons cannot be achieved without nuclear non-proliferation. Concerning North Korea, the G7 nations reiterated their unwavering commitment to achieving complete, verifiable, and irreversible abandonment of Pyongyang's nuclear weapons and existing nuclear programs. They added this also includes any other weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile programs under relevant UN Security Council resolutions. The leaders also demanded North Korea refrain from conducting further nuclear test launches that use ballistic missile technology. In an effort to seize Pyongyang's nuclear threats, the G7 urged all states to fully implement sanctions. The G7 reiterated that North Korea cannot and will never have the status of a nuclear weapon state under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The regime has argued that North Korea is free from any NPT obligations as it withdrew from the treaty in 2003. The vision also comes as North Korea is widely expected to launch a military spy satellite using long-range missile technology banned by past UN Security Council resolutions. The joint statement is the group's first to focus exclusively on making a nuke-free world, stressing a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
And on China, the G7 leaders have reaffirmed the need for peace in the Taiwan Strait. The heads of state discussed issues regarding China during a working dinner at Japan's Miyajima Island on Friday. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said attempts to change the status quo unilaterally by force will never be recognized anywhere in the world, and that it's crucial to show the G7's strong will to preserve a free and open international order. They also reaffirmed the need to urge Beijing to press Moscow to end its aggression in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine is dominating discussions at this year's G7, with member states promising more support for Kyiv and tougher measures against Moscow. Our Song Yu-jin reports.
The war in Ukraine was a key topic during the first day of the G7 summit in Hiroshima. Member states released a statement reaffirming their unwavering support for Ukraine and their commitment to opposing Russia's aggression. The bloc pledged to continue providing financial, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic support to Kyiv for as long as necessary. This will include budget support, recovery efforts, and the restoration of critical infrastructure through trade and investment. Additionally, the G7 nations will strengthen sanctions on Russia, restricting the export of items essential to its war machines, such as industrial machinery and tools. This is to, quote, starve Russia of G7 technology, industrial equipment, and services. The joint statement also urges third parties to immediately cease supplying Russia with weapons with severe consequences if they do not comply. China and Iran are among the countries suspected of doing so. And the G7 will build upon existing measures to limit Russia's energy revenue, including export bans and price caps, to prevent Russia from weaponizing energy against the international community. At last year's G7 summit in Schleswig, Germany, member states agreed to launch a price cap on Russian crude oil and petroleum products. Additional restrictions include curbing Russia's use of the international finance system and limiting trade and the use of diamonds sourced. These measures aim to achieve comprehensive and lasting peace in Ukraine as soon as possible. 송유진, Arirang News.
The Group of Seven is putting their heads together once again, this time in Hiroshima, to solidify their commitment to keeping the international order based on the rule of law. Let's look back on day one and what's to come with Dr. Pung Young-sik. Thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
So the Group 7 has already issued a statement on Russia's nuclear use in Ukraine, right? Now, what's your take on this, and how effective will such a collective voice be actually?
Well, the G7 summit meeting held now in Hiroshima, Japan, is a combination of a short-term response to the major international crisis and a long-term commitment to the big achievements that has been sustained since the end of the Second World War, including the absence of a nuclear war in human history. It is very symbolic that the G7 summit meeting is held in Hiroshima alongside Japan as the only country suffered from the attack of nuclear weapons. So the G7 leaders' Hiroshima Vision on nuclear disarmament highlights this point that we underscore the importance of the 77-year record of non-use of nuclear weapons. So the big achievement, the no more nuclear weapon use, should be maintained despite the current disruption of existing international security. So Russia has announced the intent to possibly use tactical nuclear weapons in the war in Ukraine is a direct threat and challenge to this international commitment to the nuclear non-proliferation. So the vision statement clearly stipulates that Russia's irresponsible nuclear rhetoric, undermining of arms control regimes, and stated intent to deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus are dangerous and unacceptable. So G7 leaders and invited leaders, including South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, made it really clear that there should not be any compromise on the front of a nuclear non-proliferation. And that also applies to, as reported, North Korea's pursuit of its own nuclear capability. So United Nations Security Council Resolution 1718 and 1874, which prohibits North Korea to conduct any nuclear tests and ballistic missile technology tests, should be maintained despite North Korea, China claim that the G7 leaders, including the United States, should recognize North Korea's genuine and legitimate concern for its own security. But G7 leaders made it clear that North Korea's argument has no ground.
Right, and the fact that the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, is attending the summit in person this time speaks a lot about how seriously the member states are taking the...
Right, so it is no question that Russia, China are the two major agendas at the G7 summit meeting in Hiroshima. I see a great deal of a continuity of the international commitment to support Ukraine's effort to win the war against Russia. The Madrid G7 summit meeting held July last year happens to be the first foreign affairs action taken by at the time newly elected president of South Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol. And the Madrid NATO summit meeting actually adopted the new strategic concept joint vision, and it clearly warns the China posing a systemic challenge to the security of the Euro-Atlantic community. That was the first time that the NATO summit meeting actually mentioned anything about China. And it also warns the deepening strategic relationship between Moscow and Beijing. So the warning and concern about the deepening strategic relationship between Moscow and Beijing, which was accentuated at the NATO summit meeting last July, is another, once again, repeated in the Hiroshima G7 summit meeting.
Right. So the Hiroshima Vision on nuclear disarmament is issued to really keep not only Russia, but also North Korea in check. Then let's talk about China, you briefly mentioned. What about G7's stance on China's assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific region? I mean, how can they translate their worries into action, actually?
That's a very tough question. The NATO summit meeting joint statement actually highlights the China posing malicious hybrid and cyber operations backed by military buildup, and China's ambitious and coercive policy should be stopped, which is not only limited to the European continent, but as you said, in the Pacific region. So geography is no longer a physical concept, but it's more like a sociological and a cultural concept that transcends the physical boundary of the national borders. So it is legitimate concern for the G7 members to express their concern about China trying to unilaterally revise the existing international system to maximize its benefits. You mentioned what kind of feasible and specific responses should be made to prevent China's revision of the existing international law and the institutions. And it is very interesting that the national security strategy released by the Biden administration last year, 2022, actually touched upon the issue. What kind of a feasible measure should be made in response to the rising power of China? It highlights the importance of domestic industrial policy and investment. So the capability and resiliency of the United States to win the competition against China must begin at home. So strengthening the middle class and the high technology industry of the United States should be the starting points for the United States to, in the long run, prevail in its competition with China. And that type of long-term investment and long-term strategies are highlighted at the G7 summit meeting in Hiroshima this time.
Right. The G7 summit really appears to be getting on the China's nerves, with Chinese President Xi Jinping holding his own summit with Central Asian countries as well. Now, moving on, what we're also anticipating is a trilateral sit-down with Yoon, Biden, and Kishida. Now, if they do sit down, it's highly expected that they will talk about security issues. Now, why security again, Professor?
Well, unfortunately, the security threats posed by North Korea, armed with nuclear warheads and many types of different missiles, has not been abated. Had it been any reduction of military threats posed by North Korea, then the trilateral security cooperation among U.S., South Korea, and Japan might have been reduced as well. But when you're facing ever-growing significant military threat to your existential security, then you have to take necessary measures in response. So as I see a great deal of continuity between the 2022 NATO summit meeting held in Madrid, Spain last year, and this time G7 summit meeting held in Hiroshima, Japan, I also see a great deal of continuity in terms of the strengthening security cooperation in trilateral context among U.S., South Korea, and Japan. From the Phnom Penh trilateral summit meeting held last November, and the trilateral summit meeting held this time in Hiroshima and Japan. So unless there is any sign that North Korea is going to show any genuine sign about reducing its military threat and capability, that it has been pushed since the 8th-Party Congress held in January 2021, especially the development of the 5 new types of strategic weapons, then South Korea, Japan, and the United States are left with no choice but to take necessary measures in response.
Right. The trilateral cooperation does appear to be inevitable almost, especially at a time when North Korea is on the verge of launching its first spy satellite as well.
Right, definitely.
Right. And now you briefly mentioned the Phnom Penh talks. The heading of their talks will be an extension of the talks there in Cambodia now, where they agreed to share real-time North Korean missile information. The question is, how much information sharing will actually happen between South Korea and Japan then?
Well, I would say that there's a substantial amount of real-time information sharing actually taking place, not just between any pair of these three countries, but between all three countries. It's a very effective division of labor and function. I would say that South Korea, being the closest to the origin of North Korea's possible military threats, will be the first country to take notice any urgent signs of North Korea's military action, and it will be shared with the military satellites of the United States military, which has fixed the eyes on anything happening on the Korean Peninsula. And it will be also shared with the Japan self-defense forces to take the necessary individual and joint actions. So the rule of thumb here is that the more, the better. If one eye is not perfectly enough to have a preemptive warning and necessary action, then three eyes must be better than one eye.
Right. But the thing is, there are concerns that the three sides may have different understandings when it comes to sharing real-time North Korean missile information. Now, for instance, the missile sharing information could be interpreted as South Korea joining the U.S. MD system, right, to China, right? Then what's your take on this?
Well, that has been the argument made by Chinese government. Then the South Korean government has not endorsed the assertion made by the Chinese government that this is South Korea taking additional steps to officially join the missile defense system led by the United States. But I would say that that's a groundless claim on the part of China. The China's claim is based upon so-called three-no policies made by former governor of South Korea, Moon Jae-in administration of South Korea, in the aftermath of the bilateral meeting held in October 2017. After the bilateral meeting was over, the Moon Jae-in government announced so-called three-no positions.
Right.
Here, important point is that it was declaration of Moon Jae-in government's position, not announcement of the joint agreement or South Korea's official promises made for China. It was just general positions announced by the Moon Jae-in government, not representative of the sovereign state of Korea, but the administration's position, which include that first, Moon Jae-in government would not introduce any additional THAAD system from the United States during its tenure. Second position stipulates that Moon Jae-in administration would not push South Korea to enter into the missile defense system of the United States, as you mentioned. Third point is the South Korea under the Moon Jae-in administration will not develop trilateral security cooperation between South Korea and United States and Japan into official trilateral security alliance. But as I said that even with the confirmation made by the Madame Kang Kyung-hwa, at that time foreign minister of the Moon Jae-in government, these were only South Korean government, Moon Jae-in government's statement of the positions, but they were not any official bilateral agreements forged between Beijing and Seoul. And we have a leadership change from the Moon Jae-in administration to Yoon Suk-yeol government. So there is no official responsibility on the part of the South Korean government to be restrained by any policy that would prevent South Korea from joining the missile defense system. However, despite the fact that South Korea has the rights and capability to actually join the missile defense system of the United States. If necessary, South Korea at this point has no intention or official plan to join the military system, defense system of the United States. The point is, as I said, that South Korea needs to build up its own missile defense capability in proportion to ever-growing and ever-threatening missile offense capability of North Korea.
Right. Korean Peninsula issues have been here for a long time and will be here on the peninsula for a while now. All right, Professor Bong, it's only day 2, so let's keep an eye on today and also the upcoming day tomorrow. Thank you for your time this afternoon. Hiroshima has been picked by Japan for this year's venue to emphasize the importance of nuclear disarmament. The city endured a devastating loss of lives from an atomic bombing, including thousands of Koreans. And President Yoon was the first ever to meet them. Our Kim Do-yeon has this story.
President Yoon, for the first time as a South Korean president, met with 10 surviving victims of the devastating 1945 Hiroshima atomic bombing. Offering his condolences, the president reminded them they deserve to be recognized for the hard-fought battle they went through and how they stuck together and looked after each other afterward in the absence of their government.
다시 한번 희생되신 우리 동포분과 또 그것을 지켜보고 또 그 후에 이렇게 그 민단에 몸을 담고 우리 동포들을 위해서 열심히 노력해 주신 여러분들께 다시 한번 감사 말씀드리고 오늘 늦게나마 여러분들 이렇게 뵙게 돼서 참 다행이라는 생각도 들고.
According to South Korea's foreign ministry, the A-bombing of Hiroshima killed around 30,000 Koreans, and around 20,000 more were affected in some way. And many of these victims were displaced from their homes in Korea as the Japanese government brought them here for forced labor during World War II. While the Japanese victims were taken care of by their government, the South Korean government had not been able to. And the fact that they didn't want to expose themselves to radioactivity made them hide even further. But at this point, they can show their appreciation.
I've lived for 80 years. This is like a dream come true. I was hit by the atomic bomb when I was just 2 years old.
While these victims have spent all their lives in Japan, many of them did not give up their South Korean citizenship. And with that, President Yoon promised that they will be better taken care of going forward.
우리 동포들이 원자탄에 피폭을 당할 때 우리는 식민 상태였고 또 바로 해방과 독립이 됐습니다마는 나라가 힘이 없었고 또 공산 침략을 당하고 정말 어려웠습니다. 그러다 보니까 우리 동포인 여러분들이 이렇게 타지에서 이런 고난과 고통을 당하고 있는데 대한민국의 정부와 국가가 여러분 곁에 없었습니다.
Before President Yoon leaves Hiroshima on Sunday, he's set to visit the Korean atomic bomb victims cenotaph with Prime Minister Kishida. The victims showed strong support for this unprecedented joint move and hope that this will improve the bilateral relationship going forward. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News, Hiroshima.
And the Hiroshima atomic bombing in 1945 not only took away the lives of tens of thousands of ethnic Koreans, but also scarred many others. Our Han Sung-woo spoke to some survivors.
I'm the longest living survivor of my family. All my siblings are gone. I'm alone now. I want to join them in heaven as fast as I can, but life, unfortunately, doesn't work that way. I still pray so that I can see them soon, though.
95-year-old Lee Soo-yong was just a 17-year-old Korean girl living in Hiroshima when on August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb dropped from the sky, destroying the city and changing her life forever.
Black rain fell from the sky. Black rain! And my face and whole body were left in a bloody mess, covered in bruises.
A countless number of glass fragments pierced her legs, leaving them swollen to the point she has lasting side effects to this day. E is one of an estimated 1,800 forgotten first-generation Korean survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. Tens of thousands of ethnic Koreans perished, many of them victims of Japanese forced labor.
78 years have passed since the end of World War II, but it's not over for the Korean survivors of the atomic bombings. The first generation is dying from disease, while their children and grandchildren suffer from genetic birth defects, not to mention the mental damage. Then there's the cold shoulder they get from society.
The Korea Atomic Bombs Victim Association, headquartered in Hapcheongun County, Gyeongsangnam-do Province, fights for the rights of these survivors and their families. It has even won hard-fought legal victories for the victims against the Japanese government, granting them proper medical care. So for them, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's upcoming joint visit to the monument in Hiroshima dedicated to the remembrance of the Korean victims is good news. But the association believes more can be done. The head of its regional chapter in Hapcheon, Shim Jin-tae, says follow-up measures from the Korean government are necessary.
The government must follow up with measures to take care of the children and grandchildren of our survivors. We also ask the government to make efforts to preserve the tragic history of the atomic bombings and set it right by supporting the Victim Association.
There's still a long road ahead to true liberation. But Yoon and Kishida's planned visit to the monument on Sunday might be the first step towards that end.
우리 뭐 이제 나이 많아서 힘이 없거든요. 힘이 없습니다. 그 지나맞고만 넘어지고 엎어지고 이렇거든요. 그런 사람들 좀 도와주면 좋겠습니다.
한성우, Arirang News.
That is all we have at this hour. We'll be back at 6 p.m. Korea time. Thanks for watching.